In 1818, former President John Adams made a surprising observation about the birth of the United States. He wrote, "The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the hearts and minds of the people." The actual physical fighting was just the final consequence of a deep psychological shift that had already happened. By 1763, the British North American colonies had matured into an economic powerhouse. Their combined population had exploded to over 1.5 million people. With generations of self-government behind them and the neighboring threat of French forces recently eliminated, the colonists were eager to expand westward and claim new land. Across the Atlantic, the view was entirely different. The British Crown had just drained its treasury fighting the French and Indian War. Parliament needed to spread the costs of maintaining its vast empire and expected the American colonies to start paying for their own defense. Fearing a costly series of Native American wars, the British government moved to lock the colonists in place. This map outlines the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It drew a boundary right down the Allegheny Mountains, restricting all Western settlement and reserving that territory to maintain royal control. London viewed the colonies as a remote asset to be managed and contained. The colonies, meanwhile, saw themselves as highly capable, autonomous partners. That misaligned expectation laid the groundwork for the conflict to come. Looking for revenue, Parliament aggressively enforced the Sugar Act and then introduced the Stamp Act of 1765. This required a paid revenue stamp on all legal documents, newspapers, and pamphlets. This engraving from the period features a skull and crossbones emblem, proving how morbidly the colonists viewed this new financial burden. The Stamp Act was a massive political miscalculation. By taxing paper goods, it applied financial pressure directly to the most articulate and influential groups in American society, namely the journalists, lawyers, and powerful merchants. These groups had the platform to articulate a defense. They argued that because they did not elect members to the House of Commons, Parliament had no right to levy internal taxes against them. The phrase taxation without representation became a rallying cry, and soon prominent men began organizing into secret protest networks known as the Sons of Liberty. The protest quickly moved from pamphlets to the streets. Mobs destroyed the imported stamps and forced customs agents to resign their posts in terror. Trade with the mother country ground to a halt. You can see the scale of public mobilization in this illustration of a crowd hoisting a banner reading, "England's folly and America's ruin." British merchants felt the sting of the economic boycott and pressured their government to back down. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but to save face, they immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting they retained the absolute authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The colonists took away a distinct lesson. Polite petitions had accomplished little, but highly organized, economically disruptive riots had successfully forced the most powerful empire on earth to reverse its own laws. In 1767, Britain tried a new fiscal strategy. The Townshend Acts placed import duties on everyday items like glass, paper, and tea. When Bostonians physically resisted the customs officials trying to collect these duties, London dispatched military force. This illustration captures the overwhelming presence of British warships and regiments landing in Boston Harbor to protect the tax collectors. Placing heavily armed troops into a hostile civilian population created constant friction. On March 5, 1770, a local mob attacked a group of British soldiers, who eventually fired into the crowd, killing 3 people. This engraving of the Boston Massacre was specifically engineered by radicals like Paul Revere as pure propaganda to incite outrage across the colonies. Faced with intense backlash again, Parliament executed a strategic retreat, repealing all the Townshend duties except for the tax on tea. Tensions cooled, trade resumed, and the colonies entered a brief period of economic prosperity. Radical leaders like Samuel Adams refused to let the anger fade. He argued that leaving even a single tax in place meant Parliament still claimed the right to rule over them. To keep the controversy alive, Adams induced Boston to form a committee of correspondence to state their grievances and requested other towns draft replies. Committees soon appeared in virtually all the colonies. they created a deeply connected, decentralized infrastructure of political thought. If a royal governor dissolved a local legislature, these underground networks could still communicate and coordinate across hundreds of miles. By trying to enforce order with military strength, the British government had inadvertently handed the radical faction their first martyrs, and the exact justification they needed to build an invisible, independent political system. The breaking point arrived in 1773. The British government granted the struggling East India Company a monopoly on all tea exported to the colonies, allowing them to bypass independent American wholesalers entirely. It threatened to put colonial merchants out of business. The colonial response was direct and massive. In Boston, a band of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships and deliberately destroyed the cargo, dumping it into the harbor so the tax could never be collected. Official opinion in Britain almost unanimously condemned the destruction of the tea. Parliament retaliated with a series of severe laws that the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts, aimed at exclusively punishing and isolating Massachusetts. These new laws restricted local authority, banned most town meetings, and crucially, closed the port of Boston entirely until the ruined tea was paid for. For a maritime city, severing access to the sea meant absolute economic disaster. Parliament assumed this severe quarantine would terrify the other colonies into submission. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Viewing the assault on Massachusetts as an assault on all their liberties, the sister colonies rushed to its defense, sending smuggled supplies and provisions straight through the blockade. The attempt to surgically cut off Boston failed. The heavy-handed punishment served as the ultimate catalyst, infecting the rest of the North American continent with a shared sense of defiance. In September 1774, 55 delegates traveled to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. As seen in this depiction, men from distinct provinces, representing diverse opinions, sat in a single room to coordinate a unified response to the Crown. They moved beyond petitions. The Congress formed a Continental Association to enforce a massive trade boycott. More importantly, they spurred local organizations to strip away remaining royal authority, begin collecting military supplies, and mobilize troops. There was still a faction of moderates who favored negotiation, but King George III flatly rejected any compromise. He declared, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." That single statement eradicated the middle ground. It silenced the moderates, terrified and isolated the loyalists, and pushed the colonial leadership into a corner where armed independence became the only logical path forward. By relentlessly attempting to centralize control and extract revenue, the British Empire accidentally forged 13 fractured colonies into a highly organized, unified nation. The Crown lost the American Revolution in the minds of the people long before the military war began. In the early morning mist of April 19, 1775, a band of 77 colonial Minutemen stood in the village of Lexington, Massachusetts. They intended to stage a silent protest against a detachment of British troops marching to confiscate their gunpowder. As the Americans began to withdraw, someone fired an anonymous shot through the fog. The British answered with a volley of lead and a bayonet charge, leaving 8 colonists dead. By the time the British retreated to Boston later that day, militiamen firing from behind stone walls had inflicted over 250 casualties. Yet, even as they cut down the king's soldiers, the vast majority of these colonists still consider themselves loyal British subjects, fighting a local dispute over taxation and military presence. This created a bizarre political paradox when the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia a month later. The delegates voted to induct local militias into a formal Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief, yet they simultaneously sought to avoid a permanent break from the mother country. In July 1775, they adopted the Olive Branch Petition. As the formal script and the signatures of the colonial delegates show, it was a plea begging King George III to halt further hostilities until they could negotiate a peaceful agreement. The king refused to even read it. Instead, he issued a royal proclamation declaring the American colonies to be in a state of open, armed rebellion. The colonists were now trapped in a dangerous position. They were locked in a bloody, escalating conflict against the most powerful military on Earth over localized grievances, but they lacked a unifying national identity to sustain a prolonged war. That missing ideological spark arrived in January 1776, courtesy of radical political theorist Thomas Paine. Paine had immigrated from England less than 2 years prior, but he recognized exactly what the fractured colonies needed to hear to move toward separation. This 50-page pamphlet, titled Common Sense, reached a massive audience across the colonies. It sold 100,000 copies in 3 months, circulating rapidly through taverns. Paine argued that one honest man was worth more than all the crowned ruffians who ever lived, urging colonists to reject hereditary monarchy for an independent republic. By June, the Continental Congress recognized that public opinion had moved toward Paine's vision. They appointed a committee of 5 men, with Virginia delegate Thomas Jefferson taking the lead, to draft a formal resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. The result was the Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4, 1776. Drawing upon Enlightenment philosophy and John Locke's ideas of traditional rights, Jefferson universalized them into the natural rights of all humankind, arguing governments derive power only from the consent of the governed. This text provided the colonies with a concrete objective. Jefferson's language turned a legal dispute over taxes into a unified campaign for human freedom. But declaring independence and securing it were 2 different things. In the months following the Declaration, the American forces faced a military reality that pushed the rebellion to the brink of collapse. General Washington suffered heavy losses in New York, executing a retreat from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and eventually being pushed across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. His shrinking army endured freezing conditions, lacking adequate food, clothing, and basic supplies. The revolution survived because Washington launched daring, surprise counterattacks against British garrisons at Trenton and Princeton in the dead of winter, capturing British prisoners and reviving flagging American spirits. In response, the British devised a massive operation for 1777 to crush the resistance. General John Burgoyne led an invasion force south from Canada, intending to drive down the Hudson River and isolate New England. But the British plan underestimated the American landscape. Burgoyne's army attempted to navigate untamed wilderness while dragging heavy European artillery and immense supply trains. His columns bogged down in thick mud and dense forests, slowing to a crawl. This logistical failure allowed American forces to surround the exhausted British troops at Saratoga, New York. After failing to break through the colonial lines, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of 5,500 men. The victory at Saratoga provided exactly what the American diplomats needed. It proved to observing European powers that the colonial militia could outmaneuver and defeat a major British army in the field. The surrender at Saratoga shifted the diplomatic landscape, drawing the attention of the world's major empires. Benjamin Franklin, stationed in Paris, leveraged the Saratoga victory to sway the French crown. His efforts secured a treaty of alliance that provided the Americans with essential naval power and the vast majority of their gunpowder. Britain suddenly faced a multi-front war. France was openly hostile by 1778, Spain entered the fray a year later, and by 1780, the Dutch Republic was also at war with the British Crown. The British pivoted their military focus to the southern colonies, hoping to exploit local loyalist support. Instead, they were dragged into an exhausting war of attrition as colonial militias attacked their supply lines across the Carolinas. The trap snapped shut in the fall of 1781. General Charles Cornwallis positioned his British army at Yorktown, Virginia, but a French fleet successfully blocked the Chesapeake Bay. This cut off any chance of reinforcement, while 18,000 French and American troops laid siege until Cornwallis surrendered. The defeat at Yorktown forced the British government to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially acknowledged the sovereignty and freedom of the 13 former colonies. The United States emerged through a process of expanding alliances and ideologies. The war concluded as a global victory, but the task of building a single nation from 13 states had only just started.